I suppose I'm live. This might not be very bantery in the sense that I may be by my lonesome today. George is coming, so we'll kind of get it started. Hold on just a sec. All right, a little mix up. George is coming. So I usually have a kind of kickoff with people, and then I did not have time. Good to see you here, Alex. So I'm gonna frame this a little bit before he gets on, because what we're going to be talking about is how does a small vendor like BVoIP or other organizations like think about security first, right? And I actually had some great conversations about this with Alex Farling. I was quite impressed. Oh no, yeah. I apologize, but Alex and a couple others. But ultimately, if we look at a couple of framing things today, we see CISA and actually all of the Five Eyes community, right? So Australia, New Zealand, Great Britain, us, and one more. But ultimately, all of the Five Eyes community were putting out a notice to MSPs saying, hey, there's a threat here. Let's maintain transparency with your end consumers, make sure they understand cyber risk, make sure they understand how to report incidents, da 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 da. But they're really just saying, kind of MSPs, we see you. But then ultimately, in the same just how broken the world is conversation, this morning I got a feed that says that the DEA, among I think 6 other CGIS networks, were compromised as well. And the funny thing was the threat actor said there was no two-factor, just a username and a password, which means even as we talk about these things of the very basics and the government stands up and CISA and different departments stand and say we need to educate our public, we also sit in a situation where at the same time there's the hypocrisy in play that hasn't been done there either. George will be on. Hold on just a sec. I've messed George up here, so let me get him right. Hold on. This is why prior planning prevents PPP, as I understand it. Probably it's not another time. Okay, so George will be here in just a sec. I apologize. I'm actually going to post the link in the chat if anybody wants to join us in the interim, but George should be here in a sec. Let's see. Yeah, Stuart, I love the link there, right? I actually posted about this, I think, a week or two ago, or a week ago, maybe. Everything seems like a week ago, though, at my travel schedule. But yeah, I mean, this is the reality of bringing some of these things to bear. And colleges are almost the worst. And I don't mean to point fingers at colleges, but ultimately, colleges for me um, have been really unresponsive. When I was at our former MSP, we had a lot of tracking on people that were sending phishing links, and we were tracking down and perusing through that data. And as we did that, we found several colleges that had been obviously compromised. And as we reached out to them, it was just really hilarious because, I mean, hilarious, and I don't want to cry away, but it was really hilarious in the sense that they didn't care. One major college even responded to me and said that they, George, give me just a second to finish this up. One major college even responded to me and said, that's a subdomain, right? That's a subdomain. We don't manage that. So they had a very healthy cybersecurity response team. They legitimately said, we don't manage the subdomains. You're going to have to take that up with that kid that we pay $9 an hour. Anyways, George Bardissi, do you mind introducing yourself? I have screwed you, my friend, for our show and our listeners,
Okay.
watchers. But that's on me. I didn't have time for us to have a warm-up session, which would have
That's
been
all right. Technology is great when it works, and then when it doesn't, that's what people are
no,
done
no,
for, right?
sir. No, I will not let this be a technology problem. This is a
Okay.
MattLee process failure. This was
Okay.
not a tech failure.
It's okay. It's all right.
Yeah,
Well,
yeah,
yeah. So my name's
yeah.
George Bardissi, founder and CEO here at BVoIP, and actually MSP initiative, and actually even still have a little MSP based out of Philly. So been in the technology realm for a little while now. I'd say going on, let's call it 20-ish years, 21-ish years, and yeah, I've been in and around Mr. Lee and company for some time.
I'm
We've had some
sorry.
good times, probably more than I could recall right at this particular moment. But yeah, I told Matt before, as I was dialing in, I was like, it's okay, it's my birthday, so I get a mulligan, right?
Oh, you stole it from me.
So,
You can't introduce your own
yeah,
birthday,
no,
George.
it's okay. I'm trying to
This is bad
trying to push
protocol.
back
I
all
was gonna do it.
the late start stuff. No,
You're
I
killing me.
appreciate that. And Stuart, yeah, Bills and Eagles into this year in the Super Bowl, that would be fantastic. I'd sign absolutely up for that.
I love
Big
it.
Eagles fan here from Philly. So, but
Getting
don't hold
lots of
that
happy
against me.
birthdays. Yeah, getting lots of happy birthdays, right?
Appreciate that.
Um,
Appreciate that, guys.
anyway, so let's talk about this, right? Oh, sorry, John popped in. George's favorite cheesesteak can be
That's not
oh,
true, John. That's not
oh,
true, John. There's only
I
the
knew
original. That's the only one that
yeah.
counts. So tell your other guy he needs to work on his cheesesteak chopping abilities. But
That's
definitely don't
hilarious.
buy cheesesteaks outside of Philadelphia. You probably won't get, especially in Ireland. I was in Ireland before the pandemic, Matt. I was
Where are
walking
you?
down the main strip in Dublin, and it said Philly cheesesteaks. I'm like, really? And then next to it said with Irish beef. I was like, we're way off the beaten path here.
Yeah, for sure. Okay,
Yeah.
so let's get to it. You are, and I don't mean this in any diminutive capacitance, but what I would quantify as a small producer of code, if you will, right? You're a smaller company that serves a lot of customers,
Yeah.
but the code is not represented by some Fortune 500 company with tons
Correct.
and
Yeah.
tons of money to protect
Mm-hmm.
themselves. So how do you do it? Like, tell me about your journey from startup until now. And I think, what I was wanting to point to is that people starting up now have this in their ear already, but you started
Yeah.
how long ago, George? Take me back
Yeah. I
there.
mean, it's a good point, Matt. So, yeah, the challenge that we tried to fill out, so obviously George MSP, right? Kind of came up like everyone else, right? Projects, break fix, bronze, gold, silver, one plan to rule them all, bunch of vendors, bunch of tools, bunch of software stacked together, right?
Yeah.
One of the challenges in our early MSP days were, like this on phone system stuff, right? And copiers and a bunch of other things, right? Obviously in MSP land, standardization is important. And we
Yep.
felt that there was something missing from a telephony standpoint in VoIP land. And so there was a lot to it, right? But generally speaking, like from 2003, 4, all the way to, let's call it late 2014, we went through
So
a crazy journey. Yeah.
when was your code base born? What year?
No, this is important. Hold on.
Okay.
So starting in 2014, like 2013 and 14, we started building code, right? And here's
It's
the
that one
problem.
moment. Yeah.
Correct. We started building code. I mean, there was people that came before me, by the way. Let's just make sure that's clear. There's a lot of companies, right, that started from MSPs that turned into a vendor SaaS
Tons.
solution. Right?
It starts with, I make this to save me money, and it
Correct.
saves me enough money that now I go, wait a minute, or saves or makes, I suppose, either way you want to lay it out.
Correct.
But
Solve the problem,
efficiency.
right?
Yeah, it solves
exactly.
X. And now
So
you're like,
like, there's people
others
that can't.
would do this. Yeah, yeah.
Correct. And there's a lot of successful companies, regardless of where they ended up today, right? But like Chris Day at IT Glue, perfect
Yeah.
example, right? And
Yeah.
other companies, right? The guys over at Connect Booster from BNG, Directive in New York.
Yeah.
The
I
Dozell
want to
brothers
pause
with,
you for just a second,
yeah.
because hold on just a sec. I misattributed earlier when I was talking about another vendor that actually walked me through his security path and what they are doing today and what would be done if you started. He's using Terraform. He's using ephemeral machines for certain transactions. He's, you know what I mean? He's doing those kind of things that
Yeah.
if you have a code base that started in 2014 or 2017 or even 2019, you probably aren't using some of those componentries
That's
in the
right.
modern microservice world, if you will.
That's
But
right.
anyways, point being that misattribution was actually John Harden at Saslio that helped walk me through that. And was
Yeah,
very,
and we're
very
gonna
awesome to
run
have.
into
So
John actually on the next Channel Strong tour, which we'll talk about later. But
nice. Nice.
so in 2013 and 14, we started writing code. And so Matt, here's the reality: when these people pop up, when these MSPs say, "Hey, I'm doing a little bit of like DevOps type stuff," and they decide to start building stuff, they realize that they probably can't do it all on their own, and they start with outside resources. Like somebody's managing things internally.
Yeah, I get the emails every day, right?
Correct.
We have a very good secure development team that's fast, and 100%, right?
So we start with outside resources, and we try and you do work on this, you work on this, you work on this. And like, Matt, I'm not going to lie, right? Sometimes that stuff, iteration 1 wasn't good enough. Scrapped it.
Well, and it would
2,
have been in a waterfall model, or it would have been in something that was this very, and maybe I'm conflating a few things, but also very monolithic, single application that contains all, and all variables are variably available throughout. And so you get into this kind of situation where you have some real attack surface.
We went through a few outside vendors kind of in a linear path, right? Where we scoped stuff out, we spent a lot of money, and it only ever got like here, right? And like this was the finish line.
And what was your understanding of here? Like, you mean as the code base from an MVP perspective, or as the code base from a security perspective in your mind?
Like, this is what we want. We're working backwards from our outcome. And like, we never really got to 100% of the end game of where we were trying to go. We only got
which part though is what I'm asking.
The actual, customer experience of the solution, right?
Okay, so you're talking about that end of it. Thank you.
Correct. So what we started to realize was, hey, like, we're after this outcome. We want this car to be finished at the end, and like we're missing a door here or a window there, and and then just like everything else, Matt, like construction, right? You go to build a house or you go to build a building, and you're like, oh, it's going to take 2 years. And then there's rain.
2 weeks.
And then
2 weeks.
And then all of a sudden 2 years turns into 4 years, right?
100%.
So there was a lot of that. I'm not going to lie. And listen, in just like MSPs network, right? The SaaS company founders also network, right? And like, this is kind of what happens, right? Everybody starts down this path, and then they realize it's a lot bigger than you think. And you can't do it all by yourself in the time that you think. And you can spend, like wheelbarrows full of money to try and fast forward it. But at the end of the day, it just takes time, right? Especially if you're going to be QAing your stuff and validating it and running it through outside code checker, type companies to validate that your software is secure, and do all the stuff that you need
help validate, right, from a wording perspective. To help validate. One of the biggest, because there's always business logic flaws, right? Like Alyssa Knight makes her entire career right now on exposing API business logic flaws. And you can't test for that in Dash.
And let's face it, Matt. I mean, because we spent a lot of our time tying into the tools in the MSP sandbox, right? They're constantly changing, right? The big guys are constantly changing their stuff.
There's more risk in that exposure probably as well. Like, that's massively a good point. And they're not always changing for the better. Sometimes they're shoehorning in more stuff that could.
And by the way, we like when they send those updates out, right? Pick your favorite company, pick whatever name it is, and they said, "Oh, by the way, here's our, we've made all the following changes," and all of a sudden there's like an entire revamp required. Just maintain, right?
Yeah, yeah. Well,
So
this one's going to take us tangential, but I do always love where Shiva's head's at. How do you take into account issues like Code Cove being breached and changing code instead of verifying it? Like, I think what we have to remember is that at some point, the 1% edges are the 1% edges. Now, that doesn't make them any less viable, but that is really a supply chain code problem. That do you do dynamic? Like, do you have two different ones that are validating each other? Is that what you do? Like, I love the thought experiment, Shiva. But George. So one of the things I want to point out, and I sometimes like to be a little contrarian, but a lot of what you've even spoken about has really just been about trying to get the car door on so that the passenger doesn't get rained on, let alone make sure the lock works. Right. And
correct.
I think some of the challenges, and I don't mean to maybe make an oversimplification of that, but my point is that you now are making that mental shift yourself into, okay, the security part has to be even more than just sending it through code base. QA does help a lot. I love the thought process you have there. But what's that shift? What does it take to make that shift so that security is first in people's mind?
Well, I'm gonna be honest with you, Matt. I'm just gonna go backwards in time. I think the big problems in our day, right, the last year or two, or maybe
Yeah.
even three in the space, has really woken everyone up to, hey, like, you got to make sure your stuff's right, because you don't want to be the guy that's the source of a
Yeah.
larger issue, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
think the MSPs of the world out there, and technology providers are starting to get hip to the fact that they need to get their own stuff in-house cleaned up and make sure that they're good. And now they're
Yeah.
starting to ask their vendors, do you have this? Do you have that? Is it locked down?
Yeah.
Is it, is there an audit trail? Is it this? Is it that? You're only as good as your weakest link, right? I know that's a cliche, but it's true. So at the
Yeah.
end of the day, the other thing we have to think about, other than the MSP and how they are open to things, is like when we start to work on the other side, right? When the path for vendors, right, in the space is either you're working direct or what we call indirect, right? And so when you start going down the indirect path, there's larger people above you that now
Yeah.
want to make sure, are you good? Do we want to, before we bring you in and start offering a solution, through an indirect partnership, do you have these checks, covered, and do you have your stuff in place? So,
Yeah.
when you start going through that, it's like, hey, instead of just waiting for that to come down, you need to be proactive, right? There's third parties that you can bring in and subscribe to help do the checking, and help you, review your stuff, and also make sure that you're putting the necessary roadblocks in place to kind of, keep your barrier of entry as, hey, you have enforced MFA, simple, right? I know
Sure.
it's like very one little aspect in the overall scheme of things, right? Or, hey, can you do SSO, and how do you implement that? Or, hey, do you take a, I hate to use the word zero trust because it's being used in a lot of
Sure.
different ways, right? But you take a lockdown approach first and then begin to work backwards from who has access to what and how things are exposed. So, I think the last 2 or 3 years has really woken everyone up. I think a lot of the
Yeah.
vendors in the space have really said, hey, I guess I really need to go and do these things now if I haven't already done them, because the MattLees of the world, and they're out there, are going to say, why aren't you already doing this?
Yeah. Well, and I think, thank you for attributing the Matt Lees of the world. I appreciate it. There's a lot more than me, and they're smarter probably. So, but I want to touch on something, and then I want to share something on my screen. So I have Jessica Bishop, and she's always awesome. She adds a lot of value to these presentations, and conversations. But I don't know if MSPs are the same way. But it was discouraging doing request for proposal responses in other industries and seeing how much the companies that they're competing against, or potentially their own companies she worked for, right, tend to fudge their security stance just to get a contract. And I think that's because the questions are very basic. And what I mean by that is, in the RFPs, it's kind of like going to the doctor in the past when you're getting that first checkup and the questions they might ask. Now, you go to the doctor after you've passed out in your living room floor and are coming back from a concussion, and they want to figure out why. I bet there's a lot more questions, and I bet they're a lot more specific, and they get into actual testing, and they get into actually things that'll help you more than just anecdotal, yes, we're good. What I want to share is what I am thinking about leaning towards when I talk to vendors or people about this. And George, I don't know if you're familiar with this, but it's a concept by OWASP that's been put out. It's been out for a while. But what it does is it's the application security verification standard levels. And essentially, it's starting to ask questions about your architecture. It's starting to ask questions about the way you handle secrets, about the way you handle tokens. And it's going to take a very developer level ability to answer this, or some automation methodologies. I'm sure there's tons of them out there. But the ASVS is a amazing guide. If you get into the actual form, which I'm not going to force you guys to look at today, I don't think. But if you get into the actual form, it really does tell you from a grade, at least attempts to, and understand these are never great and perfect, but they attempt to give you a security verification score. And then you can start making decisions. Right now, you can empirically say, I can't do business with you, George, because you're not a 6.4 or whatever it may be. And now you can actually have 10 or 12 ways you might be able to get up in that score, right? In the sense that you may not be able to deal with the way you're handling your session tokens today, but you might be able to deal with something that is doable. And I'm being, I'm not a developer, so understand if I just destroyed your hearts on development, I'm sorry. But you might be able to handle those things differently and correct your score. Then you can just start raising the tide. Right. Then as you start doing that, you can incentivize vendors that reach a top level score. You can de-incentivize vendors that reach a low level score. Like, you can imagine a world where we could start having those indirects, like you said, be guiding your decisions from a monetary perspective at a board level or at a George level, right? As you start thinking about this out of your pocketbook.
Yeah. I mean, listen, at the end of the day, there's a lot of standards out there, right? I mean, this is a great, option, right? And back to the point of what Jessica said, I think part of the challenge when it comes to the RFPs is that the procurement department that's putting out the RFP doesn't really even understand what's being put in the RFP from the people behind them, right?
Yeah,
I think that's part of the problem. And the other part of the problem is, just like you go to fill out a cybersecurity insurance questionnaire that says yes or no, like, there's 40 questions underneath of that really should be answered, but the person who's sending that questionnaire out couldn't even answer those, right? There's somebody behind them that has to be able to answer things, to be able to make sure we're all on the same page so that they can do their job to determine how much risk there is.
But when you start getting into vendors, though, especially as you're using, and maybe I'm being tangential, right? Because I'm still focusing on this scoring system methodology, and you were speaking towards the RFP process. But imagine that if you're a vendor and a code producer, not everything's a technical control, but this guide speaks very much towards the technical aspect of it, plus a little bit of the process side. But you could probably harvest that information by scanning the code base, right? So the same type of people that are doing the dynamic scanning could now score you and be the third-party vetter for that score,
but
right?
I think people who are putting out the RFP, Matt, would need to say,
sure.
Hey, in order for you to qualify to submit an RFP, right? You need to come. We're using this outside company. They're going to do a scan of your solution, and you need to be at least this in order to submit your solution as part of the RFP.
100%.
But 100%. And I know that that's not really what's happening out there.
Well, it's because Shiva defined it for us, right? I didn't know the R stood for lowest common denominator, and the F was the change plus. But lowest common denominator plus change orders. But I think he's also talking in some ways about the preparers of those don't necessarily have any translation from whatever the regulatory requirement or non, heaven forbid, and then translate down to an actual RFP that can be scored and makes sense in some way, and you can have some barrier to entry. To your point,
I think everybody needs to, because every industry is different, because whether the RFP is coming from corporate America, government, small business, whatever. I mean, you and I both know RFPs are really more things that happen in a larger organization rather than the sub 100 employees, sub 500 employees sometimes organization. I think everybody just needs to understand that there needs to be a standard. But Matt, whose standard, right? And everybody's all over the place, and there is no one guide, right? So that's always the challenge.
But I think that is the point for a vendor creating code. My argument actually is, and I've met some of the creators of the ASVS and have spoken with them, and this has actually been a brainchild for a hot minute, and they apply all of the things that are in the top 10 to this type of inspection. So it's the inverse, if you will, of here's the top way people get attacked. Here's how you would score people empirically of whether or not they're susceptible to that in some fashion from a percentage perspective. So this is really probably the standard from a risk perspective, in my opinion, on code and the way it's being produced and handled. And it's the most transparent way to say, here's what I've got. And when you're trying to talk about tech debt, this finds tech debt, right? Because this
No.
is going to say, oh, you're still doing it that way? Oh, man. Right? Like if you look at it, there were 2 different email backup vendors out there that I knew of. And one of them went to Modern Auth like 4 months ago. One went 3 years ago. Right. And so I'm being maybe hyperbolous, but 2 or 3 years ago. But you start realizing that that's usually because of some limitation in either will, which is usually the case, thought process and lack of ignorance, which sometimes is the case, right? And or capability or money,
Well,
the
Matt,
ability to
it's
make it work.
probably because Microsoft finally said, "Hey, by the way, like we're going to start randomly shutting off access to SMTP, POP3, legacy."
That's what I mean. They're getting swept by the sweeper bar.
They just waited until the last
Yeah.
possible scenario, and then they're like, "Oh, now we need to fix this."
Yeah.
And
It's like, do you put on your parachute until the sweeper bar comes and pushes you off the edge? Like, I'd prefer to be already with parachute and running at the edge.
But Matt,
getting hit
some
by
of the
it,
big companies in MSP land also have waited until recently to change that, right? Like before it was, hey, let's just go create an app password, right? And then that's your workaround until something else happens. And now they finally just adopted the newer approach, right? But I mean,
yeah.
But
Eric, you're right, Eric. I'm not saying that you don't have to take in the other security controls to secure your house. I'm just saying there's an additional point now when you are making code where you are now responsible to be able to say, I'm staying up with the times. And OWASP Top 10 changes every year, right? If you notice, the biggest thing in OWASP Top 10 that was like a salacious, if you're a nerd like me, was they started including this kind of arbitrary aspect in it. I think it was in number 3 or number 4, right? And it's like, it was about secure design. And you're like, that's arbitrary as shit. I mean, if I'm honest, right? If I recall. So anyways, but you're right, Eric. You do need to take into account the other hygienic aspects, the other how I manage my own passwords and my own users, my own IAM, my own, right? But if you combined OWASP Top 10 / ASVS with CIS, if you're a code producer, and CIS alone, if you're not, and you focus really heavy on being good at those, you're probably going to reduce your risk pretty heavily, right? Microsoft, and I don't believe this, but Microsoft calculated as 99%.
When it comes to the development process, I think it just comes down to, is there a focus internally to stay on top of the security side versus the actual product and what it does? And I think that's something that needs to be prioritized now, probably more than ever, just because they're, whether it's the nation state actors, whether it's just some guy in his basement, whatever, these guys are out there, right? I mean, and they're just digging. So
here you go. Here's a question from Shiva for you, George.
Yeah.
George is, that's right. I do an audio version of this too, right? So George, as a vendor and an MSP, how do you feel about security vendors selling the fish instead of teaching how to fish?
The big challenge, Shiva, and I'm sure, this, but, and everybody else does, is that a lot of the MSPs out there do not have the knowledge internally, right, to actually react, right? I mean, old school, right? You get an RMM and you have no, DevOps, or coding guys in house in order to build out your own scripts. You end up outsourcing that to someone, right? And so, like, when you talk about the vendors and how they're putting stuff out there, they're assuming that you don't have the knowledge internally to do what you need to do, and they're trying to Fisher price it. I mean, that's really what it comes down to. Because if they put out all the security documentation and they don't have a MattLee or a Shiva or an Eric Taylor, and they're like, I have no idea what I'm reading, they're going to need to go outside their organization to even start working on it. And so that's why they're making it as Fisher price as possible and deciding things on behalf of the MSP ahead of time, because they assume they don't have the knowledge internally.
Fair enough. Yeah, Eric does point out that OWASP updated every 3 to 4 years, but every single one of them is still empirically attacked every day. So I get it. You're right. But, let's talk about the DEA. We've been telling we need MFA for years and years, and the DEA gets hacked because of a username and a password, right? Like, I don't know if y'all saw that article yet, Eric, but I think, being a little hyperbolous, but security frameworks just aren't being applied. And to George's point, even if you were to do that, a lot of times there's not necessarily even the expertise to do it.
I mean, CISA puts out guidance all the time, right? And then, the MSPs are like, half of them can't even understand half of what's being put out there, right?
I like Shiva's point too, actually. I really do. Because this speaks towards something that does bother me in our world is, at some point, you are responsible for letting people suck at what they do. And I mean that, like, even if I point back at Microsoft, why do we have to educate people to have a secure password that's long enough to be secure? Because Microsoft won't just turn off the ones that aren't and make it not possible to make it that way. Well, why? We don't want to lose revenue. And so I think
Right.
at some point,
Because if you can't use the product, they won't pay, right?
Yeah. Oh, I love this too, Shiva, right? Because I love pointing out this hyperbolisness, right? See, just as a joke in real world implementation. And yet people get so up in arms about it. And you're adding your support layer and and they're right. That breaks that rule. Yet when you still point backwards, the people that basically to some extent own CISA at its very high level, right? Especially at least the federal prosecution level, right? Or at least the federal investigation level, I suppose. Aren't using them. Like they don't have two-factor on, right? And so, yeah, I love the hyperbole.
I think part of the problem with CISA, for whatever it's worth, is they leave it to the individual police departments to do it. And the people
and self-report kind of, right? Like
correct. And the people who are running
the
the police departments of the world are not technology people. I'm sorry. They're just the lieutenants and all those people downstream from the guy at the top. They're police people. They're not computer people, and they just don't understand.
And this is kind of my argument. What if you could not have 2FA? What if you could not have strong authentication, right? Microsoft released in their report, and I wanted to point at the hyperbole of this, right? Or the hypocrisy of this, right? In the sense that Microsoft said only 22% of their tenants have strong authentication on, and 78% have not elected to do that. The fact that they're reporting on that and yet not enforcing that just as a methodology to say, I don't care. We're going to lose the revenue. We're going to do the right thing. We're going to treat that as a risk reduction across this, right? Because you have this like belief that people are going to leave if you do that. Google did it, right? With 2auth on everything. And people didn't just say, I'm done, never using Google again. Anyways, but
but I think Microsoft, right? Like if you're at, what is it, business premium and above, they literally have a security center where you just say, set defaults, right? Set Microsoft defaults. And they just go and deploy those for you. But you actually have to go and press those buttons, right?
That's my point, right? Like, why not just make that part of it? And I think there's a couple of answers there. Well, there's probably 100 answers there. But I think this is the shift that could make the biggest impact in our world, is if vendors, back to Shiva's initial point, saying, I think onboarding should be mandatory, otherwise zero free support. And I think what he's pointing at is, just in the same way that you go get some security tool, most people haven't set it up correctly, right? You look at the WAF in front of I think this was back in the Experian hack or Equifax breach, right? They had a WAF that would have stopped some of the things that were happening. They just didn't do it. They didn't configure it, right? And I'm not saying WAF solve everything. It was just in that specific instance. But the point is that if you had a vendor that said, yes, you got a WAF, you now must buy the implementation package. There are going to be monetary aspects to this. I get that, right? And you could have the vendor just only, but if you set a standard that said, here's a buried entry, which is a barrier to sales, which is what is the reason people don't do this, but you would have more efficacy in the product being delivered. And granted, it would come down to what the security risk is. It would come down to some of those things. And I bet some of it you can just code in. You can just say, yeah, you have to have two-factor to access our phone system.
It's interesting, right? Obviously, we're talking about this from a security level, but isn't the current modern approach to the vendor and the SaaS solutions out there a freemium model, right? Hey, come in at our lowest level for free,
right?
Test things out, see if you like it, and then we're going to try and upgrade you from there, right? I think part of the problem is the front end people, the sales and the product people. They're trying to get people in at the lowest possible level just to see that the solution does what you think that it does, so that they can, obviously progress from there. And if the lowest common user can't figure out how to log in, then they won't use the free trial or the freemium product, and then the rest of the business side doesn't work, right? So I just, there's the real world to that.
Yeah, it's crazy. Oh, sorry, I got a notice about a ransomware from somebody. It's a SEC filing by Omnicell, healthcare company that just actually had to do their first SEC filing about this potential breach.
Well, I'm sure that those government bodies are going to influence. I read an article somewhere in the last couple of weeks where they're basically forcing publicly traded companies to have a security officer on their either on their
Yeah.
board or
Oh,
within their.
dude, you're getting that was like literally, maybe I'm gonna get made fun of for this. It was a wet dream for me, bro. Like I saw the future so clearly from that. If you look back to Sarbanes-Oxley, right? You had to have a financial person on the board, and what that did for some of the public trust around financials after Enron, right? And now you start getting into, what if we expose the board to one loud bastard that's going to sit there and go, "Hey, I want you to understand that as a board member with votes, you're not doing this. You're not putting that new feature ahead of this. I understand we have a public trust challenge here." And being able to have an argument that at least educates them so they can make a real decision on what they're doing at that level. But the other part, which I think is where my prediction comes in, that's a little bit contrarian, is that's how you wind up with the Martha Stewart treatment too. Because the other part of that regulation was that you're going to have to start reporting residual risk in from your board, which means you're going to have to actually know your risk, which means you're not going to be able to just lie about your risk to an extent that you would have known, you should have known, someone was telling you, and now you didn't do it, right? In the board meeting notes where Matt was a jerk yet again, and now you haven't done it. You could wind up with people in handcuffs for SEC violations, right? For lying to the American public. And the SEC has teeth. So I'm extremely excited about this because everybody else just calculates the money of it, right? Everybody else just goes, it's only going to cost us this much. Our opportunity's this much. This is stupid. I'm doing it. As compared to, I could go to prison and lose my livelihood and all the fun things I enjoy.
And that's the reality, right? I think everyone is rushing now to put this stuff in place that don't have it, right? Because I'm sure the next part of this, Matt, like you mentioned, is they're going to have to report on it. It's going to be part of their quarterly filings, right?
Yep.
They're going to have to put their kind of security risk analysis out there. And once you file something, then you're going to be beholden to it, right?
You're going to be beholden to it. And you're going to be beholden to it in a sense that you can't plead ignorance in your miscalculation of it. I think that's what the big delineation will be. And this is my prediction, right? Like this has time to bake in. But I would wager as we start to become aware of it, we're not making anything new here. That's what happened with Sarbanes-Oxley, right? You couldn't say, I didn't know I couldn't have 97 holding companies that were all buying and selling from each other and report that as profit, right? Like it didn't make sense. And I'm oversimplifying that statement too. But once they added those financial people to the board and then tightened the constraints of reporting and then made sure that you started getting into a pattern that could easily be replicable in the at least in the enterprise and public world.
The challenge, though, Matt, is if you're a private company, right? Like Elon, right? He's taking Twitter private, right? They're not going to be publicly traded once that's done, or going to MSP land. Once the Kaseya data transaction's done, right? Data will be a private company again, right? Those private companies may not be on the same under the same regulations as the public ones.
Yeah, but they will come under, I lost George for a sec, but they will come under the understanding that private equity is starting to ask the questions, right? Private equity is starting to say, I need to know my risk. And we realize there is a big risk here. That's why the insurance companies are mad. There was risk and they earned that risk and lost money. Right. And so you start looking at it. And I'm not sure if Eric's starting to drink because he disagrees wholeheartedly, or if Eric's starting to drink just because of the realization of where we sit and how long that vision might take to come to fruition, 20 years, 10 years, whatever it is. But either way, I'll drink one with you, brother. So
I think the reality is the VCs and the PEs out there who, as part of their growth strategy, when they do their investing, hope to take a company public potentially as part of their how they progress through their process. They're
100%.
It's behooving for them to ask the question up front. But Matt, they're not going to be required to ask it.
They're not. And I think my point is that we solve things as capitalists with financial means and controls. We tighten and loosen money as a result of these ebbs and flows and understanding, right? You don't support a builder that's going to put the studs on 22 inches and never get a single house with a single, like you start getting into a world where as these controls and as these things start to become real, right? Because in reality, Scott Augenbaum, FBI agent, does his speech, and on his, he said, I thought we were done and we were going to solve this in 2014, right? Because he's an optimist like me. Right. I believe. I just want to keep smiling until it happens, but it may not. But he said, I thought we were done because after the Target breach, everybody was going to figure this out. And how wrong was he, right? Like how much of a joke is that? And he was pointing it out for that reason, is that here we sit, 8 years later, 7 years later, and we still are wrestling with the same problems, right? It hadn't changed. And corporations, let alone SMB, MSP, haven't really even understood that security is more than tools, that security is a posture and an
Well,
understanding and a choice.
you've been preaching this for years, Matt. Right? Security was like, oh, I'll deal with that later, right? And instead of embedding it in into the entire story. So I think that there's no at this point, because the security related incident is so crushing, I think everybody realizes at this point they need to be proactive, and if they're not, from a capitalist standpoint, Matt, they're just going to be crushed, right? Their
Yeah, I
customers
love
will
it.
leave
They
them.
should be. I mean, ultimately, they're playing with your and my lives, and my mission is because my children, right? If they want to have the same virgin experience with technology that you and I got, I could just pick up my phone and trust that I could play Angry Birds. We have to change this. We've built our entire world on sand in some degrees of that. Eric sees it every day, right? So, real last question here because we got to wrap this up. But Shiva asked you, George, as a vendor, what's your take on enterprise vendors having more at stake, re-security, kind of all the stuff we just talked about, SEC, attribution, feds, and accountability, than MSP vendors?
I
Like,
mean, the accountability is that the enterprise vendors have a further reach, right? I mean, you would think I
I
almost kind of.
disagree. I actually think there's more heads under
Then I just
management.
popped in my head, right? On the Kaseya breach, they were like, oh, only 50 MSPs but those 50 MSPs represented how many businesses, right?
Exactly.
And now
That's
I'm
my
like
point.
thinking backwards. I'm like, oh, that's not actually right.
I
But
love
here's
you. You're
the
willing to
problem, right?
change.
The enterprise vendors, right, who are dealing with the fortunes and the government contracts, and they're in the supply chain of these larger situations, right? Airplanes and food manufacturing and all the logistics and all the stuff, right? Like, I think there's more scrutiny at the enterprise level because of where they sit in the chain. And I think a lot of the times the MSPs are so far down into the chain that they're not scrutinized as much.
Well, and
Still, there's a problem.
here's my theory on this, and I've been preaching this theory for a while as well, and it's probably somebody else's before that, so I apologize if someone else has already thought of this. But I really believe that no matter what product you're talking about, ever in the history of time, from the first stick to the first sharp rock to the first sword, I don't think ever the product rises much above the maturity of the consumer. Right. And so as the consumer's maturity is extremely low and the things and the questions they're asking and the passions that matter to them, then the product is where it's going to be. And I think as an MSP vendor with MSPs that have traditionally been extremely immature in the understanding of what security are down, I used to tell people it was about 15 years behind corporate. Corporate's been using RSA tokens for years in a lot of places. You've seen 2FA. And so like the MSP has had a lower consumer maturity. What I love about that statement is the obverse of my theory is also correct. No product can go very far behind the maturity of its consumer, or it will no longer be, and it will be crushed by capitalism. And so I think unlike something in maybe Soviet Russia with brown car is a brown car and you get another brown car, here we have the whim of the consumer. And so that maturity is raising. Shiva, look at what you know. Look back what you know that you didn't know 5 years ago. Look back at like my world, I was an ignorant person. I did stupid things. I did insecure things. I was an idiot. That was only been 10, 11 years ago.
To work.
Yeah. And as the maturity went up, I happened to find myself in C space. I happened to work with a lot of people that reported to Northrop Grumman and that reported to Lockheed Martin. And so we started getting into, in 2016, 17, like, this has to be better. And I go, holy crap, I don't do any of this stuff. And I do that bad thing. And I do that bad thing. And so we started changing. But that's where my theory on this maturity pulling and pushing, right, that the consumership. I think.
But to your point, and I'm just, but Matt, I'm just going to reiterate to Shiva's original question: are the enterprise people, how do they relate from a vendor standpoint from the MSP vendors? Well, the reality is that because they're dealing with higher profile clientele up top, you said the barrier of entry is the buyer, is the user, right?
Yeah, well, and they're more mature.
Because the enterprise vendors dealing with an enterprise client, their ask is going to be much more than.
That's my theory.
Yeah, exactly.
Yep, 100%. Well, brother, I appreciate it. We didn't talk about any of the time on the road, but you and me chatting about your world in front of a dryer for about 4 hours at midnight.
Yeah,
if you recall, it was kind of the seminal moment.
It's amazing what happens when you're in a bus rolling around the country. Like crazy conversations start.
Yeah, because remember the dryer was shaking, and I would just sit.
In that one hotel. Yeah.
I held it for like an hour. Yeah. Just so we could talk about security and life and your product and what you were building. But I really appreciate you coming on, man. This was a great chat. I love being able to articulate some theories that are in my head, and you really do a good job of pulling that out. So I appreciate you. and everybody else that's here asking
Appreciate you,
questions.
Matt. You got it,
So.
guys.